The Liberating Arts seeks to articulate the enduring relevance of a liberal arts education during a time of pandemic and protest. Through our online platform, we will host a series of conversations with writers, academics, institutional leaders, and public intellectuals about the nature of the liberal arts, their formational purpose, and their moral significance in a time of great cultural disruption. We hope to inspire viewers and listeners to learn more about the liberating effects of these arts on their own lives. To find out more, please visit www.theliberatingarts.org or find us on Twitter, Facebook, Spotify, or YouTube.
My name is Jeff Bilbrow, and I am delighted to be joined today by Francis Su to talk with you about math as a liberal art and how math can play an integral role in liberating us to better love those around us. Francis Su is the Benediktsson-Karwa Professor of Mathematics at Harvey Mudd College, and he is the past president of the Mathematical Association of America. So he is outstanding in his field as a mathematician. But I think, as you'll see, he has a rare gift for doing high-level mathematics and then writing about it in a compelling way for a broader audience. And just to give you a hint of what that sounds like, I want to read you a sentence from his book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing, that we'll be talking about today. He writes there near the beginning, "A society without mathematical affection is like a city without concerts, parks, or museums. To miss out on mathematics is to live without an opportunity to play with beautiful ideas and to see the world in a new light. To grasp mathematical beauty is a unique and sublime experience that everyone should demand." So hopefully after our conversation today, or after you pick up his book, you will have a heightened appreciation of both the beauty and the liberating power of mathematics. So Francis, I want to begin with a couple of questions that maybe address some common misconceptions that I think your book helpfully addresses. And the first one is one that I hear at my school, where sometimes liberal arts becomes kind of a stand-in for humanities. So we talk about the liberal arts, but really we mean the humanities. And your book obviously makes a case that, hey, math's a liberal art too. Of course, traditionally, with the 7 liberal arts, the trivium was oriented around the word, and the quadrivium was around math, around numbers. So this is not a new idea with you. You're trying to reclaim a very old idea. But what might be lost when we forget that math is indeed a foundational liberal art?
Yeah, great. First of all, thanks for having me. And I think this is an important discussion for all of us as we think about the future of higher education. Math is something that I think often people associate with something that I need to learn in order to get a good job, get a good career. Some people use math as a way of signaling that they've accomplished something or arrived somewhere. And so it can also sometimes be used as a way that, people signal that they've achieved something. Now, if I think a little bit about what the liberal arts, I often think of liberal arts as helping people understand what it means to live life well, to explore what is good and true, and live as a human being. And so when I think of the humanities, I often think of studying the humanities in helping me shape how I understand how human beings relate to one another. And I think of the sciences and mathematics as helping us understand how we as human beings relate to the world around us. And so I think that's what we would stand to lose if we don't think of mathematics or even the sciences in some ways as liberal arts, is we lose our understanding of our place in the world and how we relate to it and how we should relate to it in good and just ways.
Yeah, and I guess the word you settle on in your book to name that is flourishing, right? This idea that math is central to human flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, of course, I've been pulling from some of the conversations around human flourishing that have been happening uh, at large in thinking from a philosophical tradition of how to live life well. What does it mean to flourish as a human being? And I wanted to pull in this idea to think about mathematics in that way. I mean, I think part of the problems that we have these days in the way people think about math and the way that we teach math is that we've sort of not thought about the bigger, larger question of what math is for. Like, why should we learn math? I mean, is it only to get a good job? Is it only to signal a certain kind of elitism or achieve power? And so what I try to do in the book, which incidentally came out of a speech that I gave, and what I tried to do in that speech was to try to call people back to asking that question: what is math for? What are the purposes of mathematics? Because if we can't get on the same page about that, then it's actually going to lead to lots of divergent views about how math could be used.
Yeah, and you're already leading into my other question about the ways that math might be misunderstood, which is, if some people in the humanities side, and I'm an English prof, so this is where I am, tend to write off math as this irrelevant to liberal arts, irrelevant to human flourishing. Sometimes people on the STEM side, the math and sciences, can view math, like you said, as sort of career preparation or a means to get a good job, and teach those disciplines in ways that make it more difficult for students to see them as integral to human flourishing, as pathways to wonder and to a deeper beauty. And you talk about Simone Weil in your book and her brother, but I also think about people like Blaise Pascal or Isaac Newton, these profound mathematicians, many others actually, who also do theology or also do deep philosophy, so that historically math has been a discipline that was more closely, I guess, connected to human flourishing and even theology. So I guess my question is, how might we recover a view of math as a means of human flourishing, at least for Christians at Christian universities? How might we recover math as a handmaid into theology? Is that possible?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at how the public normally thinks of math, they think of math as just applying formulas, plug and chug, or maybe involving lots of rote memorization, and certainly sometimes taught that way. And one of the things that is funny when you think about that is that if we think about what we're teaching our kids in mathematics, or what we ought to be teaching our kids in mathematics, it's really how to think well. And learning how to think well and carefully is actually what is going to stay with you the rest of your life, right? It's not going to be the specific facts that you memorize that are going to be important. When most people come to me and ask, employers are looking to hire math majors. They're not looking to hire them for necessarily for specific mathematical knowledge. They're looking to hire them because they're creative problem solvers, because they can think well, because they know they have a certain persistence that in sitting with a hard problem for a while and not necessarily solving it right away, but they know how to sort of push through the hard thinking in order to get through the other side. And so I like to think of these as mathematical virtues, right? Persistence, creativity, endurance, confidence in struggle, the ability to reflect, the ability to generalize and understand patterns. These are all virtues that stick with us. And these are the things that I think are the most important. This is part of what it means to think mathematically. So, and of course, one of the things, the virtues that when you do math well, that is built is a certain sense of awe and wonder, right? When you see a pattern that you've discovered, and someone completely separated from you in time and space and culture discovers the same pattern, then you begin to think that there's some underlying reality that you're experiencing, and that is somehow transcends physical space, and so this leads to a certain kind of transcendent awe. And so it's not surprising that sometimes people speak about math like others speak about theology, or in divine terms. And so math, I think, is in some ways a handmaiden to theology. There are lots of parallels. If you think a little bit about, and there's lots of ways that they inform each other as well, right? Like, so for instance, as a mathematician, I have understanding of the infinite. And, when people talk about God being infinite, for instance, as a mathematician, I know how intricate and amazing that statement is. And so, there are ways in which my understanding as a mathematician of some of these profound, beautiful, deep ideas like infinity and symmetry and beauty in mathematics, how that can help inform a life that seeks to step outside itself and look at bigger things.
Yeah, I was talking to a colleague this past week, and his daughter is taking school online. She's an 11-year-old, I think, taking school online because of the pandemic, and she's doing her math problems on the iPad, and I think she's doing fractions, and it's time test, and if you get it wrong, it locks you out, or it's such a frustrating experience for her, because if she has questions, there's not really anywhere to go. And he was kind of lamenting, how is this gonna make her hate math? Is this gonna ruin her? And I was sort of contrasting that when I teach the Divine Comedy, it ends with this vision of the Trinity that Dante has, and God is sort of the three persons of God, or the circles, and then he talks about how is it possible that Christ, who is a person, is also the God, and he relates it to the problem of squaring the circle, as trying to understand how Jesus could be both man and God. And it's this really intricate mathematical analogy he's setting up there. And I usually, try to draw on the whiteboard, try to at least explain enough math so my students are like getting what he's doing. But I think, our students formed in our school system, are they even like, that's not, Dante is doing math in a whole different way there. It's not some sort of, as you said, chug and plug, it's not this rote. It's a portal to awe and to the infinite, and to kind of naming these patterns that are almost beyond human perception, right at the edge of perception. You talk in your book about the different kinds of infinity there are, and how so that it's a way of being very precise about mystery.
Yes.
And I worry that the way that we teach math, will kind of lock so many people out of understanding math in the way that you describe it.
Yeah, and I like that you use the word mystery. That's central to the mathematical experience, is uncovering mystery, right? If we see a pattern, we want to understand why that pattern exists, and see it as part of a larger narrative, so that we make meaning of the things that we see. That they're not just random things that happen, right? Like we're in the middle of a pandemic, and those of us who have had mathematical training understand what exponential growth means, and how important it is to get a pandemic under control at the very earliest stages. And that's a certain kind of ability to see hidden patterns that I think it would be great if everyone would have. And yet the way we teach math often isn't like that at all. There's no mystery at all. It's like, okay, well, here's some stuff that a bunch of dead people 400 years ago taught us, and we need to memorize without necessarily doing the hard work of understanding. And so one of the things that concerns me a lot is that your friend's daughter is because she's worried about time tests and the performance that's associated with that. I do worry about people conflating math with being quick, right? Like I like to think that math is actually, it's more important to be slow than to be fast, to think about ideas really deeply. And that's something that's very central to the idea of studying anything as a liberal art, is to think about simple ideas in deep and profound ways. And that's how math is done. And yet somehow your friend's daughter is getting the message that math is about recalling things in very quick ways. And to me, that's math being used in harmful ways.
Yeah. Well, you've already mentioned this, but you talk several junctures in the book about, I think you say math is the power to see hidden patterns, or it's the science of patterns. And I love this phrase, the art of engaging the meaning of those patterns, right? Like understanding what a pattern means, what it's analogous to, what it's not analogous to. And when with reading those sections of the book, I thought this is a lot of what poetry, I teach poetry classes, and we talk about analogy and metaphor all the time. Do you have any insights into how sort of mathematical modes of relating disparate ideas and mathematical modes of identifying patterns might be both similar to, but also different and distinctive from verbal modes?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, of course, we're getting at the trivium and the quadrivium here as well. One thing that's really been fun the last few years is I've actually been teaching a writing course at Harvey Mudd. And in doing so, I've noticed a lot of commonalities between writing and mathematics. In both are, I think, in both communication is central. The ability to construct arguments, and making creative choices about how you communicate and construct those arguments and build up those ideas and present those ideas. And so especially in poetry, I mean, poetry is all about like creating a feeling in the reader, and you want to choose the right word and choose it carefully. And that's very similar to mathematics, because in math, often there are multiple ways to understand something, and mathematicians are always searching for the most beautiful, the most elegant way of seeing a pattern or seeing an idea. And it's exactly the same feeling. Like if you pick the right word in a poem, it's the same feeling you get when you see the right way to understand an idea. There's great satisfaction when you do it well. And of course, on the other side, there's also a lot of anxiety people have around mathematics. But it's similar in some ways to the anxiety people have about writing. Like if I ask my students to write an essay and you get writer's block, you're like, oh no, how am I supposed to write an essay on this and do it by tomorrow? And so, yeah, so there's that. I think in writing and in mathematics, clear communication is actually intertwined with clear thinking, right? If you're not able to think well, then you're not going to be able to communicate your ideas well. I think there's some differences, though. I mean, I guess one difference would be maybe the degree of precision about the meaning of ideas. That, if I have a conversation with you about a mathematical idea, I guess math often tries to quantify or to clarify the ideas with good definitions. And maybe I don't see the same level or the ability to be that precise about ideas that aren't mathematical. And that could also reflect my own lack of understanding about the English language. But it's not to say that the English language doesn't have distinctions or nuances or good definitions, but I think it's often harder for people to converse about it. Whereas if you get two people to talk about a mathematical idea, there's often very little in the way of people misunderstanding each other as long as they have the right they've agreed on a common definition. Yeah, so I don't know. I guess there's lots of similarities and maybe a few distinctions as well.
Yeah, I like what you said there. And it's probably true that, for instance, poetry is notoriously hard to translate, but math, I think you can communicate, as you just said, you can communicate across cultural or linguistic barriers
Yeah.
pretty well, as long as you have the right notations and formulae. So that's, and maybe, and also it's back by what you said earlier about this sense of awe at these truths and patterns that transcend time and place.
Yeah. I just thought of another example as you said that. So like, yeah, math, people think of math as a language in some sense. And there is this, it is true that like, if, there might be a mathematical idea that I understand through a certain subfield of mathematics one way, and then in this other subfield, I understand it another way. And there is a translation that sometimes has to happen. And it is also true that some ideas are easier to express in one language, mathematical language, than in another, right? So there is maybe that commonality, like just like in poetry, you can't really translate the poem easily to another language, but and it might be easier to express in one language than the other.
So like whether it be geometry or number theory, or
Yeah.
you can move, yeah, that makes sense.
So geometry and algebra is a good example, right? Like if I ask you to express a circle, geometrically, you think of this picture. And if I ask you to express it algebraically, you think of x squared plus y squared equals 1, right? And these are both ways of understanding the same idea, but there are advantages to thinking about it one way than the other way, depending on what you are interested in using it for or understanding.
Yeah, that's helpful. But I do think you're right too, that there is something really satisfying about the precision that math is able to provide. That is sometimes a poem can actually do that well, but sometimes there's a sense of frustration because language seems to approach reality sort of asymptotically, right? You can get closer and closer to naming what you want, but there's always a gap between the word and the reality that's signified. And obviously, in mathematical language, there's a certain level of abstraction, I suppose, too. There's no, perfect circle that you can talk about perfect circles, but you may not be able to draw one. And yet there's something satisfying about the rigor of mathematical language.
And that can be part of its appeal for some people. Yeah.
Well, I want to talk too with you, Francis, about the sort of effects, I guess, of math, or of people who are formed to see and use math this way. So I want to ask you a political question, but I do so hesitantly because one of the things I loved about your book was that in a moment that sort of politics seems to sort of subsume all the discourse, I think your book, it's very political actually, but it's sort of pretty political, right? There's all these arguments about human flourishing that have all kinds of political implications, and yet math seems sort of transpartisan, as it were, right? So I guess one passage that stuck out to me was when you briefly mentioned Orwell, and you talk about these challenges of public discourse that is so deceitful and misinformation, I guess. And you write that mathematical thinking equips us to figure out what's going on and to bother. Math explorers care about deep knowledge and deep investigation. That maybe math could teach us to pursue truth, to believe truth is out there, and to have, you earlier talked about the slowness or the patience, I guess, to figure out what's real. So I guess my question is, are there other ways that you think that math might help us to be better participants in civic discourse? And maybe not because we get statistics or something, although I guess that helps too. I mean, you talked already about understanding exponential curves and how that might apply to the pandemic. But I'm thinking on a more formative level, how do does the discipline of math shape us to be better political neighbors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I certainly in the book do talk a bit about what does it mean to understand truth, especially in an age where misinformation is rampant. And one of the things you have to first wrestle with is whether there is truth actually to be had, right? And I do find it a little bit ironic that that often now people who in the past have had maybe concerns about discussing truth and saying that there is no absolute truth, are now people who are saying, wait a minute, there is truth, and we have to stand up for it in an age where other political actors are not being truthful. And so, there's a lot of complexity and nuance around truth, I think. And I think that's what's hard to capture in our political polarization, is the fact that sometimes truths are complex, and they have nuance, and we have to avoid easy simplifications. I do think mathematical training does give us a way of thinking about truth in better ways, to avoid easy simplifications, to be able to think for oneself and not take every statement on authority. So a lot of the polarization that I see right now is happening because people only trust certain sources, and then they take those sources and they accept everything they say at face value and without thinking about it. And one thing that math trains you to do is to actually think for yourself. And so when somebody makes some statement or some claim about any fact, mathematical fact, maybe it's the size of some crowd at some event, right? You can actually do the math, understand enough about numerical estimates to be able to say, hey, I think that was an exaggeration, right? And so whether the answer you're getting is reasonable or not. I mean, that's something that teachers do all the time. Great math teachers do, is ask students to think, is my answer reasonable? And so at the same time, I guess I want to be really careful and say that, just because you have mathematical training doesn't necessarily mean that you do the transference and carry over this idea of nuance and complexity in understanding and to other domains. And so that's part of also what I'm advocating in my writing often is, hey, we train students to think carefully in mathematics, and how can we actually help people to actually do the transference and say, hey, this is actually something that should help us live well and get a better handle on truth in other areas of our lives.
Yeah, and what you're saying too about math making or encouraging you to think for yourself reminds me that it seems like a good math teacher, and you talk about this, I think, too, actually, always makes their students show their work, right? And you actually can sometimes get a lot of points on a test if you get the wrong answer, if you can show that you were thinking in a good mathematical manner. And so maybe if we demanded of our politicians or journalists, others making public arguments, to show their work in a way and recognize that you can make authoritative statements, but you have to be able to back those up with persuasive reasoning. I respect the way that mathematicians challenge each other. You talk several times in this book about times when junior colleagues, I think a grad student in one case, challenges or can't solve the problem and realizes the problem's wrong. Math is sort of egalitarian in that way, in a way that's very refreshing, because there's a demand, like, can you show that this is accurate or not? And if you can't, you got to fix it.
Yeah, and maybe this relates to a larger point around education and liberal arts, in the sense that I think we're trained, especially in mathematics and in sciences, to be circumspect about the claims and not overstate things. And that's something that's, I think, harder in the political sphere, because people are always just saying the strongest thing possible without necessarily being more circumspect in what they say.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in my writing classes, I'm always telling students to define their terms, to be precise, to not make overgeneralizations. but of course, that's not what you see in the sort of broader public discourse. Yeah. So.
And it requires a populace that is actually able to appreciate nuance and complexity, right? And
Yeah.
so that also points to the importance of growing thinkers who know how to handle ideas.
Yeah, that there's a critical mass of citizens who demand that level of precision and accountability and nuance in their public discourse, and won't put up with politicians or others who refuse to pursue truth and try to speak truth. So yeah, absolutely. That's one reason why we need, more people formed in these sorts of virtues, right?
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and of course I'm trying to call math educators to think about some of these things as well, right? Math isn't just a bunch of things that have no connection to reality or the context or the culture in which these ideas take place. And so how do we actually train people to think well in whatever context they're in? That's the transference that I think it's often missing from a math class. People think math is just learning how to add and multiply fractions, right?
Right. I mean, your book is it I think restores the human role of math. I remember my calc prof at community college would bring in like sort of one-page biographies every week of it was always some mathematician in the past who developed or proved or something that we were working on in class that week. So there's always a tie-in. But he would just read this biography and say, this person, in this time period, developed this theorem that we're going to use this week. And it was a great way, I thought, to put a human face on math and to re-embed it in a social context. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what your book does in its own way too, that math is not something that calculators do, but it's a human art.
Yeah, of course, I like to say that anything that a calculator can do actually isn't math, right? Math is about the understanding that went into how we got the calculator to do what it does.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the I guess I should mention that Francis's book has on the title "With Reflections from Christopher Jackson," and throughout, I think at the end of every chapter, there is a letter from Chris, who you find out as you read the book is an incarcerated individual and has been teaching himself really through books and then through correspondence with Francis and others, mathematics. And it's a lovely through line throughout the book, and then it culminates in this interview you have with him at the end. But I guess sort of reflecting on what you've learned from him and in conversation with him, can we talk about like what kind of freedom math provides? I love in your chapter on freedom, you say, this is something I try to get to my students all the time, that freedom is not the absence of constraints. And you say true freedom never comes without cost, relationship, or responsibility. I like to talk about negative freedom, i.e. the absence of restraints, versus positive freedom, i.e. Maybe in the context of your book or the terms of your book, the freedom to flourish as a human being. That's sort of what are you free to do? But how do you think math is a sort of liberating discipline? I mean, either drawing on Chris's experience or otherwise, how might math liberate us to use our freedom to help others to flourish and to serve our communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess one way I think about math is, as I said before, that it's the power to see hidden patterns, and really what I'm speaking to there is that it's the freedom to see the world as it really is, right? Like if I also, as I mentioned before, understand how exponential growth works, then I actually now am freed to see why quick action is necessary to save lives. That's something that becomes a lot clearer to me now that I have that lens on which to view the world. I mean, this is also again how if you think a little bit about search engines, which are now almost indispensable in the way we live today. what is a search engine doing? It is actually seeing hidden patterns in some ways. And so if we are freed up to see the patterns around us, then that is actually one way that we are able to see, for instance, the injustices that are around us, and that's one way in which we would want to hopefully see our communities flourish, is to rectify some of those injustices. Some of the things that are happening today, again, are related to social media and its polarization, and the effects of algorithms that are being used to decide who gets loans and who doesn't, or what news you see and what doesn't. There's an example of mathematical ideas that are being used in ways that are not accountable, and these are ultimately not freeing, right? So math can be used in very negative, nefarious ways as well.
Yeah, I think you cite Weapons of Mass Destruction, I believe.
Yes.
Which is a great book on the ways that algorithms can sort of perpetuate or create even injustice.
Yes.
But the sort of the flip side too is, if you understand that, maybe you could, as you're suggesting, I think, recognize those and work against them.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and so that's that's part of the like I wouldn't want people to come through a math education and just if they're not thinking holistically about how math fits in, and this again points to the importance of the liberal arts. How does math fit into the bigger picture of what we're learning and why we're learning it? Then of course it's going to be easily used and misused in ways that don't achieve human flourishing for some people.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the thing about that's really wonderful about Chris and my friendship with Chris is not how much math I've taught Chris, right? That's not what the story is about, right? What I hope comes through in the book is this is really how much Chris has taught me about what does it mean to flourish in mathematics, right? I mean, here's a guy who's in prison for 30 something years. He's not going to get out anytime soon unless some miracle happens, because there's no parole in the federal system. And yet he's studying calculus. Now, why would somebody study calculus that they're not going to use in a career, right? Like that's sort of the question that in some ways opens the book, right? Why is someone bothering to study mathematics that they're not going to use professionally? And so that's kind of the journey that I've been on in thinking about, wow, like, I mean, I know math inspires me, but do I really believe that math can inspire anybody? Where would Chris be now if somebody had recognized his potential 15 years ago, right? How many people are we discounting because we don't believe they have potential? How often is it that we always think of math as a skill you either have or you don't, rather than something that an ability that can grow with practice and hard work, right? That's a very different view of mathematics that I wish more people had, and so it leads into all sorts of crazy things, right? So people think you're either a math person or you're not, right? But we don't do the same thing with other things like music, right? I mean, certainly there are some people who you say, okay, they're virtuoso musicians and they're talented, but we don't shame people because we don't say you're either a math person or you're not. We don't say people shouldn't go into a sport because you either have the sport gene or you don't, right? Everybody can grow in sport and in music, and that's certainly true in mathematics as well. And so that's...
Yeah. I was just going to say, I mean, I am not a gifted musician, but I'm grateful that my parents made me practice the piano for years, because I value music in ways now that I wouldn't and I'm still not a great piano player, but it changed me. I'm grateful for what it did to me and what I'm able to see. I think math is the same way. I'm not a brilliant mathematician, but I'm grateful that I You know, I had people who pushed me to learn math and helped me to see it in a way that was life-giving so that I could enjoy it. And it's valuable even if you aren't going to be a number cruncher.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and your example is a good one with music and practice, and there's an investment of money and time that now gives you the freedom, a certain kind of freedom you didn't have before, because your parents invested the money and you invested the time. You now have the ability to appreciate something really glorious, which is music. And in the same way, I think that's something that people are missing out on in mathematics without having that freedom to see underlying patterns.
Yeah. And I was moved by some of Chris's letters because, well, for many reasons, but one thing that I thought was moving was, on the one hand, he never sort of, he always takes responsibility for where he is and for the decisions he made. But like you said, there's that sort of question that haunts his story about what if somebody saw something in him and challenged. I mean, he says, what if I had been challenged by an adult in a way that I never was, and what if somebody saw giftings in him that nobody ever did because of the color of his skin or from where he grew up in, the neighborhood he was in, and it's this tragedy. He seems like such a remarkable person. So I think those letters and his reflections in your interview are really, I guess, bulk-wise, it's a small part of the book, but I think walking away from it, it's one of the parts that I'm going to keep thinking about and sort of haunted by.
Yeah.
Because it seems like such a tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it haunts me too. And it's I think, a really poignant reminder to us all that we don't just exist in a vacuum, and we have responsibilities to one another. And part of the argument I make in this book is that if we don't see the mathematical potential in others, we are not loving them well. And if we want to think about what love is and what it means, it also means that we have a responsibility to see and nurture the potential in every human being, including ourselves. It means not discounting our own abilities, right? Like you just did it without realizing it earlier. You said, I'm not a brilliant mathematician. And, so in some ways I would love for us to get away from the idea of math being associated with brilliance and more associated with the virtues that are developed by thinking and doing the hard work of thinking, the joy of hard work and thinking, right? And you certainly experienced that in your education, even though you wouldn't call yourself brilliant. And I think that's really what we should be after. I mean, if math is for flourishing, right, not for performance, then we would think very differently about it in the way we approach it and teach it.
Yeah, and at the end of your book, you talk about math as a way of love, and you've already talked about this some with Christopher. Why does he want to bother learning calculus if he's not going to game professionally? You write movingly, I think, about a moment in your career as a grad student when you wondered if you were not going to have a career in math. And it's like when these extrinsic goods are stripped away, when you're deciding, is math worth doing for its own sake, that then I guess there's that possibility of doing math for love, because of this desire for justice or truth, this enjoyment of its beauty. I guess I wonder, and I'm thinking also of Zena Hitz's book, Lost in Thought, which I read this summer. And one of her examples, she traces all these people who kind of recover a love for the intellectual life when they're in prison, or when they lose their job, or when when the extrinsic goods are stripped away. And I guess that seems like a true experience. But I want to hope that we could enjoy some of the extrinsic goods, right? That maybe you could be a professor of mathematics, and maybe your students could, maybe some of them will get jobs in mathematics and use their mathematical education. That would be fine. And yet they would continue to prize it for its human goods. I guess my question is, how do we rightly prioritize these things how do we remember the intrinsic goods and do math out of love? Do we have to lose do we have to lose our jobs or go to prison? I hope not.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Do we have to die to ourselves in some sense in order to appreciate what education has to offer? The intrinsic goods education has to offer. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's a question I ask myself all the time. And I think one of the reasons it's hard is that we live in a society, in a culture that prizes accomplishment and achievement. And it's so easy to get wrapped up in doing anything, whether it's mathematics or not, because of the extrinsic goods that it offers, right? The possibility of getting a good job, the ability to be seen as smart and brilliant. You know, that's something that often motivates people to do mathematics, or the ability to prove a famous theorem that'll get my name on it for all eternity. These are extrinsic goods. And, you know, I think part of the reckoning that I had to do for myself was having been motivated by all those things all my life, and then coming to a place, graduate school, where I realized I'm not the smartest, I'm not the best, I may not ever get any of these extrinsic goods that I was looking for. Is this really worth, is there still something here for me when I have to give those things up? And I would say I'm better off for it. I'm better off for having had a very difficult time in graduate school now, because I realize the things that I cling my identity to don't have to be the things that I cling my identity to. And so failure rattles me less than it used to. Success is viewed hopefully more in its proper place. Yeah, so I mean, I'd like to think that one doesn't need to go through a reckoning like that in order to appreciate both the intrinsic and the extrinsic goods. But I guess I'm a little more of the mindset that somewhere we have to do that reckoning. And you know, for many kids, it happens at earlier stages and ages, right? You discount yourself from doing mathematics because you think you're not a math person. So you leave it, and then you miss out on this whole other aspect of seeing life and the world in wonderful ways. And so the more that we can get away from achievement-oriented thinking, I think the better off all of us would be in all of our intellectual pursuits.
And maybe there is a certain truth to the fact that many people, our students and ourselves, have to experience that loss on a personal sense to really appreciate it. Maybe if more math teachers and English teachers and other teachers do a better job of articulating the intrinsic goods of our disciplines,
yes,
maybe students will be better equipped to kind of go through that dark night of the soul. And maybe it won't be as, I don't know, existentially threatening to them.
Yes.
But I think, so maybe we can lay the groundwork so that when they experience failure, because we all experience failure, it's more redemptive. We're able to sort of deal with that in more healthy ways and be reminded that, hey, that's not why I was doing this anyway.
Yeah.
I was supposed to be doing this for love.
Yeah. And one way to teach math is to say, you know, when a kid comes up with a solution that's wrong, it's just to say you're wrong and move on. But that's not the loving way to do it, and it's not a way that actually leads to. It's not the right picture of the world, so to speak, right? Like I would say the way we should teach students when they come up with an idea is, you know, I think behind every wrong idea is actually the germ of a struggle to understand, right? And so what I encourage teachers to do, and myself to do as well, is to see in every answer that a student gives, what's the thinking behind that answer? And to really, when you dig into that, you can build on the idea. Like I tell my students, if they have come up with an idea that's not right, I say, hey, you know, how can you modify that so that it actually is closer to the truth? And that's a way that I think is a healthier way of thinking about what you're doing with the formation of students, mathematically forming them, right? They have some thinking that is not quite there, but then can be modified until it gets there, right? And that's a way of building up rather than tearing down. And I think that's what love calls us to.
Yeah, that's a way of teaching that where the teacher also practices love for the discipline, but for the student in particular. Yeah. Well, amen. May your book challenge and encourage more of us, whether we teach in math or outside of math, to teach in this way and to help our students see math, but these other disciplines too as intrinsic human goods that can contribute to our flourishing.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Francis.